Attention, everybody. The views and opinions expressed on the show are not necessarily those of Acts Ministry, Acts Media Group, and or their affiliate, supported ministries, and or nonprofits.
And thanks, producer Matt. Welcome to Crime Time. This is Crime Time podcast episode 47. I'm Dr. Steve Albrecht, and I'm joining you from the Acts Media Group studios in Springfield, Missouri. For this hour, I have a great guest, Tim Keck, the managing partner of Go Bulletproof and the co-founder, along with my friend Doug Elms in Arkansas, of worshipsafe.net. We will be talking about church security. Tim's a former police chief in Arkansas, knows a lot about this subject, knows a lot about the concept of active shooters and protecting people, especially for folks in the church world, not only as church leaders, but as church employees, and also as a patron when you're going to church, keeping yourself and your family safe at church. So thanks for listening to Crime Time, where we talk about crime and crooks and cops and personal security. We'll talk about some dangerous people and lots of heroes. We'll even mention a few stupid crooks. And most importantly, I'll talk about what you can do to keep yourself and your family safe from crime and violence. As always, you need to be vigilant at home and in your neighborhood and in your community, at school, at work, and even on the road. This show exists to make you feel more empowered, more secure, and more educated on security issues and the criminal justice system. As background, I worked for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years. I now work as a training consultant, and I teach training workshops on human resources and employee coaching, workplace violence, and security issues in the workplace. I've written 23 books on business, workplace, and violence and police subjects, including guns, all of which you can find on Amazon. My 3 gun books are available on Amazon Kindle. You can always reach me at my website at crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm at Dr. Steve Albrecht on LinkedIn, and you can follow me on Twitter. I'm a big Twitter guy, at Dr. Steve Albrecht. That's ALBRECHT. You can find past episodes of this show on SoundCloud.com and new episodes on YouTube as it runs. So I'm here to talk with my guest, Tim Keck, and we're going to talk about church security. Let me give you a little background on Tim. He is a former police chief from Rogers, Arkansas Police Department, a job that he held from 81 to 2003. He's been involved with worshipsafe.net since November of 17 to the present. So he knows a lot about not only law enforcement and security, but church security in general. We're talking about this idea of keeping our employees safe, our pastors safe, the people that are visiting, and also how do we sort of get this sense in the church of inviting everybody in, but also being careful about who we invite in and paying attention to them. If we look at some of these church shootings that have happened, some of the people that have come in to do these violent acts against church parishioners have been strangers to them. How do we encourage and invite people to come into our churches, but also pay attention to what they're doing when they're inside our church? So we'll have that conversation with Tim, and we'll also talk about a little bit about active shooters. So Tim, welcome today.
Thank you.
When we look at the concept of church security, I think a lot of people still remember just even, 7 months ago, December 2019, the Texas church shooting at a place called the West Freeway Church of Christ. A guy named Jack Wilson was kind of their hero, more than kind of, definitely their hero. Saved a number of lives that day by shooting the bad guy, a 43-year-old perpetrator that came into the church with a shotgun. Also, I didn't know this, doing the research, he was wearing a fake beard and sunglasses, the bad guy. And Jack Wilson engaged with him, shot him once in the head, and stopped the event. What's your sense of that is kind of a driver for church security at really the worst end in terms of an act of violence? What's kind of your sense of that event?
Well, I mean, that they were blessed or fortunate, however you want to look at it, that they had someone on hand to be able to deal with that. And not wanting to be critical, but, kind of my background, not dissimilar from yours, is a kind of a specialized area called threat management. And so, my understanding of that incident was that the shooter had been there before, and they knew him. And this time he came in costumed. From a threat management perspective, we maybe should have seen that coming, and maybe if we'd had the skills and the temerity, maybe we could have stopped it. Once the guy comes in and he's in costume and you recognize him, and it wasn't not like a Hollywood makeup job, right? It's like a go to the Halloween store makeup job. So they knew who he was. What we would have loved to see, and our goal in all of our training is, let's prevent it. And if we can't prevent it, let's de-escalate it so that no one has to die. Of course, in a worst case scenario like happened there, Thank God they had someone who had the ability to take care of business really quickly, and he did very successfully.
Yeah, the perpetrator killed two people with a shotgun, sawed-off shotgun there, and then he was shot by Jack Wilson. And I read Wilson's interview, and I mean, the guy's a former reserve sheriff's deputy, and he owns a gun range, and he teaches firearms. And he said the biggest challenge that he had in that event was getting people out of the way who were stepping in front of him, getting ready to take the shot. Once he had a clear shot, he knew, based on this situation, that he had to shoot the guy in the head, which he did, and went over there and made sure the guy was not going to continue to fight back and save the day. So, there's kind of a sense in terms of church security that everybody is supposed to bring guns to church and protect themselves. That's not a model that you and I believe in. There are a certain number of people that have to have this right kind of training, the right kind of mindset. Previous law enforcement experience or military experience would be useful in those situations, but not everybody's supposed to be carrying guns into church to protect the whole congregation. Yes.
Yeah, and there's so much to be talked about around this element because, if this is one of the things that we tell pastors is if you don't take a leadership role and you don't let people know, look, there's an elephant in the room. Let's just recognize it. People are killing people in churches. And before COVID started, last time that we checked statistics, church violence was up almost 900%. 900%. So you can't pretend it's not happening. Of course it's happening. It's only going to get worse. I mean, you've been teaching workplace violence, and so have I since the 90s. Probably, like you, I've been saying you're going to see this get worse as our culture changes unless we make some significant adjustments. And so in a vacuum of leadership, people are going to step in. And of course, one of the things that we always struggle with is how many people in this congregation have guns. And if a shooting starts, how many are going to shoot back? And I always fear that you'd lose more in the crossfire than the bad guy could ever take out, which would be, that'd be an insurmountable tragedy.
The other thing about people and guns, you think about not only church shootings, but like at the Aurora movie theater shooting. It's a chaotic event, it's a chaotic environment, and the possibility of friendly fire is really, really quite huge there. Crossfire for sure, friendly fire. And also, it's sort of like the conversation I've always had with people that they say we should arm every teacher and teachers should have guns and all that. And I say, well, for those volunteers who go through the right screening and training at a school district, whether it's teachers or people that work as classified employees in the school, I'm okay with armed teachers and armed staff if we have the right folks in place and they've been trained. But the idea that there is a mindset, and you know this from being a former chief, that not everybody who is carrying a gun has made that crossover conversation in their head about taking someone's life. You had to do it as a cop when you started out in the 80s, and so did I, which is I don't want to, but I will if I have to save my life or the life of somebody else. And I still believe that there's a small number of people who are carrying concealed but have not crossed that bridge to say, this is a deadly weapon, I may have to use it to take someone's life, which is why I say if you're not willing to do that, then don't carry concealed. There's a mindset that you have to have which says that this is not a hammer, it's a deadly weapon. And as such, people say to me all the time, well, why shouldn't teachers be armed, or why shouldn't folks in the church be armed? And I say, well, because the police get there and they've already made that conversation in their head. They've already, when they swore in, they already knew that's what they were going to do. So in terms of tactical training, in terms of that mindset about that, the police are the ultimate problem solvers for this issue of church security, especially fatal violence. But the problem, as you know and I know, is they're not there in time.
Right.
The other thing which I struggle with the pastors is you and I have spent our entire lives keeping bad people out of good people's homes and bad people out of situations, whether it's at the park or a concert or whatever. We're always in the business of access control and security screening and catching people before they do bad things. But then you talk to the pastors and they want those people in church. They want the drug addicted in church. They want the alcohol addicted in church. They want the homeless gentleman in church. When I was doing some church security work in San Diego, we had a real strong conversation with these pastors that said, we're trying to keep these people from harming the church, and yet you want to invite them in. So there's a collision of thought process there about we're trying to save these folks by bringing them into the church environment, and you and I are thinking, I got to keep this guy out of here.
Right.
How do we square that up with the pastors?
That's a great question. Jumping back to the origin of this question, my daughter's a teacher, and so I have a vested interest in keeping those people safe. But you're right. The very first question I always ask people when they ask me, should I get a gun, is the very question you posed, and that is, can you imagine taking out your gun, pointing at another person's face, and taking their life? Because that's, you get some with a lot of bravado. Yeah, I could do that, no problem. You know what? You probably don't need a gun.
Right.
Because if you haven't thought that through and realized the weight of the answer that you're about to give, when I was chief, we had a horrific shootout, and we had an officer who came and saved the day and saved people from dying, and to this day, first of all, he's no longer in law enforcement because he couldn't deal with the chance he might have to do that again. To this day, on the anniversary of the shooting, he goes and visits the bad guy's grave and weeps over what he had to do, and he had to do it. It wasn't a sketchy shoot. It was straight up justifiable shoot. But that's a big deal, and you're right. So what I tell pastors is, look, if you don't do something about this, if you don't create a team, and of course this all depends on your individual beliefs. Some churches will never have guns in church that they know of, right?
Right.
So just letting people show up and hope for the best is a horrible idea, and saying, okay, well, we know that John carries and Bob carries and Mary carries, so we're good. That doesn't work either, because the Sutherland Springs church shooting, which was the one that compelled me to get into this thing 3 years ago, the Sutherland Springs shooting, the pastor had a gun. Many church members had a gun, but there was no plan or coordination. And the Sunday that the bad guy showed up, guess what? Pastor's out of state. No one who carries a gun normally was there, so they were left totally unprotected because it was just a hit and miss thing.
I think that case was like 24 victims, 24 killed, something like that. Yeah,
horrific.
Just horrific, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was talking to a colleague of mine in Northern California. He's the security volunteer director for his church. And so when people come in who are strangers to them, they do, which you and I have been trained to do this as well, which is they go talk to the guy. They go sit with him. They go, hey, how you doing? I'm Steve, and welcome to the church, and who are you, and how did you come across us? And they don't just say, let's watch him from a distance and see what happens. They go and actually sit next to the guy, and they engage with him.
Sure.
And that's a sort of a security shift that many people can't make, which is let's watch from a distance and see what happens, where guys like you and I would say, let's go engage with this guy and maybe knock him off the path from ideas to actions. He's getting ready to do something bad. He says, they're on to me. They've interrupted my script. They're focusing on me in a way which makes me uncomfortable. Maybe they're going to leave or whatever. So talk about that sort of sense of engagement with people that come into the building.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of our training is both for ushers and for security officers, but it's an early recognition of someone who's approaching that might be a problem. And then how do you deal with that? We encourage them to initiate a conversation and maybe do things like, hey, I notice you're new here. We got a gift for everyone that's new. If you step over here to this table, and so you give them a bag of candy and goodies in the New Testament. I don't know what you do, but it's an opportunity to engage. Maybe you just pour them a cup of coffee, and sometimes those fledgling perpetrators will come in and they don't want to do any of that. They just want to go sit down, and that's fine because one of our unmarked, so to speak, security officers will go sit with them, like you said. Another will probably sit directly behind him. So in a worst case scenario, they can take control.
Right.
They're not there to be overbearing. But see, the problem is without a plan and without a good plan, what churches do now is they really have two options. It's, hey, we welcome you, come on in, but if you misbehave, we'll kill you. Because there's no option in between, right? There's no intermediate levels. They don't have any because no one stepped in to tell them, you know. So what we try and do a lot of that is give them other options rather than having to shoot the guy if he misbehaves.
In San Diego, when I was doing the church security work, one of the biggest churches was not next door, but down the street from the county mental health facility. So San Diego has a 100-bed psych hospital, and these guys would get out of the psych hospital and wander around, and they wander over to church. Some of them were homeless, some of them were mentally ill, some of them were both, some were drug and alcohol addicted. And so what the church did, which I thought was a genius idea, is they set up a separate area, kind of a viewing area. I'm sorry, you can't go into the congregation unless you're a member, but you can sit in this room here.
Brilliant.
Where you can see the church services up on the screen. We have a bathroom for you. We have some snacks for you. So, the reason for that theory was these guys would go and disrupt service and scare a lot of people inside because of their mental illness. These guys would come in, kind of be in a contained environment, say, thanks for coming to church, see you later. You can go out this way after you're done. They wouldn't go and mix with the general congregation without it was a genius idea.
That is brilliant. We use this model called Threat Shield 5, which is a threat management model, and the outer ring of that is to avoid the problem. If you can avoid the problem, you're always better off, right? And that's a perfect example of an innovative way to do that. You want them to come into church. You want to fulfill the Great Commission. However, these people could be pretty dangerous. I mean, they didn't get an inpatient thing for no reason at all. So the idea behind letting them participate yet put no one else in danger, or the minimum amount of people in danger, that's awesome.
So you and I would agree that not all mentally ill people are dangerous, but they can certainly be disruptive. And
Yes.
a lot of their behavior is not socially acceptable, and they come into church, naked or run around or scream or threaten people or try to get up onto the stage and disrupt the pastor and things like that. So I'm always a believer in saying we'll give people sort of levels of eccentricity in terms of their eccentric behavior, but we have to draw the line somewhere. So one of the things I think that churches, especially smaller churches, struggle with, they don't have a quote security director unless it's a really large operation. But talk about the difference between a church security team versus a church service or usher team. So the ushers have a specific role which is different than the security role.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's very much a contact and cover concept, right? Which I know you wrote a book about, right? Which is the idea that that the usher is there to greet, to be friendly. I believe he should have some minimal level of training in cues to look for that might indicate someone he's seeing approaching the building might be a problem. But it's not his job to deal with that. It's his job to simply engage and be friendly, while the ideally well-trained security volunteer or member steps in to deal with any issues. It's a pass-off thing. For us, at least that's the way we teach it.
If you think about sporting events, go to a football game, whether it's high school or college or you go to a baseball game, the ushers help seat people. They make people, make sure they have the right tickets, and they come over. Somebody gets hit in the head with a foul ball, but they're not involved with breaking up the fights with the drunks. That's what the cops come over with, the security team. So I think, we really have to say to church leaders, you have to bifurcate that process. So you have a usher team, which could be senior citizens and folks with disabilities. We're not expecting them to break up fights and to pull out guns and save the day. But there has to be a way for them to get a hold of the security team, whether it's radios or hand signals or there's some sort of notification process. So talk about if you were staffing an ideal security team for a church, mostly going to be volunteers. What are we looking for in terms of their background and what we want them to bring to the environment? Sure.
We have a real specific selection criteria. I mean, you don't want the person, you don't want someone that you can't trust. And if they haven't been around a long time for you to know that you can trust them, then they're just not a good choice. Anyone new shouldn't be put into a volunteer position of any kind, let alone a security position or volunteering with the children, right? That would be insane.
We'll talk about that because I have a real concern about some of the folks that come in and volunteer at the K through 12 school or the Sunday school. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, as you should. So you want someone who's stable, who's been around a long time, who everyone kind of knows. You want someone who's not overzealous, someone who just can't wait to get a new gun because now I'm on the church security team.
Right.
You don't want that guy.
Right.
You also don't want the person who's so timid that they're not willing to engage and go sit next to someone who's coming into church who might be a threat. That there are multiple criteria. We also recommend that new people come in on a trial basis.
Right.
We'll give you 6 months. At the end of 6 months, you're automatically off the team unless we reinvite you.
Right.
Right. So, to do away with those awkward conversations of, well, gosh, you're scaring us to death. We don't want you, kind of thing. Right.
And a certain sense of reliability about showing up every Sunday or showing up every Saturday night or whatever it happens to be, because we're counting on you to be not only armed but eyes and ears, and so if you take 3 weeks off, it hurts the rest of the team. So you got to be reliable about that's commitment.
Absolutely. I mean, if you have to be willing to face the gravity of the situation, that you're a protector, and if you're not willing to be a protector, which the first rule of all that is showing up, if you can't commit to that, you probably don't need to be on the team.
Right. So talk about in your perfect world, I mean, you'd like somebody with a law enforcement background. You'd like somebody perhaps with the right kind of military background. Not everybody in the military is set up for this type of approach.
True.
But what are you looking for in terms of background, and not just sort of mindset, but they have to have certain skills that they bring to this kind of environment.
Sure. I mean, once you meet the minimum criteria, someone that's just trustworthy and level-headed and all those sorts of things, that they're mentally and emotionally able to do this sort of a thing, then yeah, I mean, obviously any kind of law enforcement background is, whether it's an MP or it's civilian law enforcement, that training and that experience, there's really no substitute for that, right? I mean, it informs your instincts to a level that someone who's never done that sort of thing will never get to. Someone who maybe has, worked for a security company. Our mutual friend Doug Elms, who owns Safe Haven Security Group, we get guys coming in and going through Safe Haven, work for a couple of years while they go through college, then they're moving it into other occupations, but just a couple of years of security experience works. And you're right, the military, the training and experience you get there can be a big plus, but once again, none of that overrides the mental and emotional, maturity and intelligence level you have to be able to do that. So I think we look at all of those things, but then when a church asks us to come in and ask us for advice and input, we mandate everyone goes through training, and it's competency based. If you can't pass the training and you can't go to the range, and man, when we go to the range, it's hard. We try to imagine what does it look like for someone to stand up in the middle of a congregation and start shooting. You've got foreground friendlies and background friendlies and friendlies to both sides. What would that look like if you had to shoot that guy? And so we set up balloons, right? A field of balloons, and through the middle of that field of balloons is an RC car dragging 2 red balloons.
Right.
You get to shoot those without shooting friendlies, and you're not allowed to shoot any friendlies or you fail.
Right.
Because that's what it would be like.
Right.
So it's hard. If they can't pass, then that's okay. They can come back and get some, get some additional training. But if they can't pass, they don't need to be on the team.
Right.
Just that simple.
So, I wrote about this in my last gun book, how difficult it is to shoot at moving targets, and how rarely for cops even to shoot at moving targets.
True.
I mean, think about, they may have you in a police static range situation move from one position of cover to the other to engage with the target, but how many times do you shoot on the run? Almost never.
Yep.
And how many times do you shoot a target that's moving? So when I go to the range, I set up the course of fire for the electronic targets to move towards me or back away or flip over sideways, good guy, bad guy. That stuff almost never happens, even in police training situations. So the balloons, we have hostage balloons and good guy, bad guy balloons. All this stuff is really critical. And kind of the parallel I was thinking about for that course of fire in the training situation would be the same things that air marshals go through.
Yes.
I have an airplane full of people. We got to get the right folks. Can't shoot the pilot. Can't shoot the flight attendants. Got to shoot the terrorist, the bad guy, the hijacker, and that's that same type of difficulty. So talk about your concerns from sort of a tactical level about crossfire and lighting, and sometimes churches are dark when they're showing a video or something like that, and it's there's a lot of environmental things going on in there in terms of not shooting each other or congregants. I mean, there's some stuff to think about as a tactical piece.
Well, there's a ton of stuff to think about, and if you're listening to this and you're a church member, you may be completely overwhelmed right now thinking about this because that never occurred to you. I mean, even if you're a gun aficionado, right? You own multiple handguns and you love that, and that's all okay. But think about your time at the range. You're probably standing still. You're probably shooting at a stationary target. It's probably a nice sunny day outside. All of those things are a great place to start. But I ran the SWAT team for many, many years. And when you go to hostage rescue school, they open your eyes about what it really takes to step into a crowded environment with one bad guy and a whole lot of innocents, right? So if you don't have the experience that I have or that you have, Steve, you got to bring someone in who does have that experience. And that's not everyone, right? That's very few people, in fact, that are willing to step in and help you in a church environment. But if it's not addressed, you're back to just kind of hoping for the best. And like my old boss used to say, hope is not a method.
Yeah, it's not a strategy.
Right.
So part of your work at Worship Safe is we have to assess the facility first. So, I know you do the same things that I do, which is say, I've got to walk through with my clipboard and my questions, and somebody who is connected to the facility as a facilities person or the assistant pastor or somebody who can say, this is the keys to this part of the building, this opens this. Here's where we have our kids. Here's where we have our congregation. Here's where we store all our materials, that type of thing. So I really feel before we get to the church security team, you as a security professional have to be able to say, I've got a sense of the totality of this place.
Yes.
Access control, lighting, ingress and egress, evacuation, fire alarm, all that stuff that comes even before the team process, the team creation starts.
Sure. I mean, that's foundational, right? I mean, if you can lock some doors and put up some lighting and maybe put up some fencing or some signage and other things and completely avoid the problem, why wouldn't we do that?
Right.
Why wouldn't we? And the answer is either people don't think it's possible or they don't know how to do it. And of course, that's why people like you and I exist, because A, it is possible, and we do know how to do it. So just let us help you. I talked to someone at a synagogue in San Diego, as a matter of fact, your old stomping ground, as they say, and begged them to let us come out. Just let us come out and help you. And of course they didn't. And then later on something horrific happened,
right.
And they wish that they had.
We had a shooting in San Diego County at the Poway Synagogue just last year. The rabbi was shot through the hand, and we had a parishioner there killed. I think where you probably have your biggest sort of conversation with especially the pastoral leadership team is denial. I mean, that thing happens in other churches. That happens in Texas. It wouldn't happen in Missouri. These things happen in other places. There's sort of a sense, too, I think, if you look at workplace violence in general, that it happens in big cities. But you look at a lot of workplace violence, small towns, small communities, small businesses, movie theaters, churches, concerts, things like that. There's a lot of denial about that. And I think, sometimes the pastors want to be forgiving of everybody and being welcoming of everybody. But you have to kind of give them a reality check in terms of the conversation. You're not trying to terrify them, but there has to be a reality check about the world we're living in now, like you talked about in the opening. These things are happening with uncomfortable, reality that we have to face here. Yeah. So what's the conversation to get them over that sort of denial piece?
Sure. Well, I try to always open with the three myths. And the reason I recognize these myths is because back when I was a patrol officer, and you and I have not had this conversation, but what got me started in the whole concept of there is a thing called threat management, and there are certain agencies that have been doing this. The Secret Service, Department of State, they do this all the time, which is why you never hear about things happening to one of their principals. So when I was a patrol officer, we had a local bad guy that we dealt with for a long time, and we saw the violence escalating between him and his wife and then his ex-wife. And we'd sit around the squad room and talk about, this guy's going to kill somebody. He's probably going to kill his ex-wife. He'd kill her family. He'd kill us if he got the chance. Yet we didn't know what to do about it. We just let it go for several years. It built. And then guess what? One day, a few weeks after he'd bought a new gun, right, which is a warning sign. Not that he owns guns, but he bought yet another weapon on top of all the ones he owned. And he went to kill his former sister-in-law. And when he couldn't find her, he murdered her parents in the kitchen. Shot them down, two of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. Just shot them to death in the house. Drove across town, kidnapped his ex-wife, drove up in front of the police department where I worked, walked in the front door. My friend Ray stood up to say, "May I help you?" Shot him 3 times and took over the building.
Wow.
We were on the outside, he was on the inside. After all that concluded, late that night, it was a standoff for several hours, sitting in the hospital guarding the victims, because she got shot twice, the ex-wife, guarding her hospital room. I asked myself, how did we not stop this?
Right.
And it's because we didn't know how. Well, I started then learning how. And my analysis of that, looking back on it, is that happened to us because of the 3 myths we believe. We believe, A, it would never happen to us. And see, statistically, it shouldn't have happened to us, just like it should never happen in any given church. But I can tell you from personal experience, the statistics are little comfort for when it is happening to you, right? So it can. And then the second thing people believe is that, well, you can't predict it. It's impossible to predict. That's also not true.
Right.
We actually did predict this. We didn't predict all the details because we didn't have the training or the informed intuition to allow us to do that, but now we do. And then the third thing was, well, even if you could predict it, you can't prevent it. Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
anything you can predict.
Yeah, and that's your situation. It's not a question of if, but when.
When?
Tell me Ray survived. Getting shot 3 times, he
Ray
survived?
survived.
Okay, good for him.
Ray did 20 years in the Army, 20 years at the PD, and he lives in Fort Worth and is doing great.
Good for him. Yeah, good for him. And you look at those situations, and everybody sort of says those things, especially the news media. The news media is like, well, this was there's no way we could have stopped this, and it just sort of happened.
He just
out
snapped.
of the blue. He just snapped. Yeah. So let's go back to something we were talking about. Let me go back to sort of the team approach. I think that where we sort of had one of our fatal flaws in 9/11 was the interoperability of the communication between fire and PD and all that.
Right.
Take that down to sort of the micro level in the church, which is you got to have something, whether it's radios or cell phones, code words, you got to have some kind of a communication process, especially, across distances in the congregation room or in the outer areas, where people can get a hold of the security team or the usher team. And I think that's sort of an afterthought. So what do you need radios for? We'll just shout down the hallway. I mean, there's got to be a communication mindset there about how, especially in emergencies, how we would talk to each other. What's your best strategies for that kind of communication process?
Sure, we absolutely recommend this. As with everything that involves tactics and stress responses, you got to keep it simple. We're big fans of just getting walkie-talkies. Even if you just go to Walmart and buy, family radio service walkie-talkies, the most basic type, dialing on a channel. Most of those now you can actually customize a channel that no one else can get on, but there's so many channels that's not a big issue. Have those. Now, what we find is oftentimes the opposite. When the church has decided to get a team, people want on the team for two reasons. A, they want to be okay to carry a gun, and B, they want a headpiece with a squiggly wire that goes to the walkie-talkie, right?
Like a Secret Service agent.
Yeah, exactly, which we're fine with. That's great because you ought to have a walkie-talkie, and you need to have practiced using it, especially under stress. We try to stay away from a lot of elaborate code words and 10 codes and stuff because they're not
right.
It's once a week,
right?
And they don't even talk every week. So let's not get used to that. Let's come up with, we got a code yellow, which is something suspicious, I need help, or we got a code red, which is it's an emergency, send everyone now kind of a thing, right? We need something that's that simple. And other than that, it's just pretty plain communication.
So one of the things we talked about, which I feel strongly about, is we have pre-K, we have K through 8, K through 12 sometimes, classes for teenagers, young adults. We have little kids. Oftentimes, if we look at a larger church, there's a school that's a satellite to the actual facility. It's connected to there, and you got kids everywhere. So we have a Monday through Friday kids security issue at church, and then we also have a Saturday, Sunday, especially Sunday school church issue. I mean, you and I can stop counting on both hands and both feet, pedophile, child molester, child abuser that somehow worms his way, oftentimes a male, into the church environment. Seems like a good guy and, looked okay. We didn't do much of a background check on him. Sorry, we interviewed him. He answered the questions sort of okay, and we let him into our environment. I have chickens. We don't let the fox into the chicken coop.
No.
So
but the fox doesn't show up looking like a fox,
exactly.
Right?
Talk about the idea that we need to be screening people out as opposed to screening people in. They're going to be in volunteer programs, running kid programs, pastor, where the pastor may not be able to supervise this person. So talk about that kind of sense of vigilance we have to have with our kids.
Sure. I mean, when we talk about priorities at worshipsave.net, we talk about protect the most vulnerable. That's who you got to protect first, and those are the children. I mean, it's a horrible thing if 5 people get shot at a church. Can you imagine what it would be like at your church if someone walked in and murdered 10 children? Oh my gosh, that's hard. That would be hard to ever get past, right, for most people. So yeah, I mean, you recognize there's a lot of energy around active shooter, right, for the last couple of years. But your kids are more at risk to be sexually abused than anything else, and that most times comes from someone that they know. So it's going to be a family member, or at church it's going to be someone who understands, because they're master manipulators. They understand how to worm their way in, and they don't just groom the child for abuse. They groom the other workers, right? They over a period of time gain trust, and they know exactly what to say and what to do to set themselves up. So our recommendation is if it's a new person, they don't go there. Right, period. Another thing that folks don't think about is who should we let volunteer? Even someone who's been with the church for 10 years. Well, and this is maybe a little bit controversial. It's just a fact, and that is, if it's a teenage boy, he shouldn't be volunteering with the kids. As a teenage boy, you got all these hormones going through your body. You're trying to figure stuff out. You're very curious about stuff, and now pile on that the presence of pornography everywhere.
Right.
Right. So that's just a place where you could put a kid in a position to make a mistake that they can never get past their entire life, right? So let's just avoid that.
I'm a believer in a background check for every volunteer.
Sure,
and so what will we say? Well, why would we spend the $35 or the $50 to background some volunteer that's just going to come in and serve punch at the school? We background everybody.
Everybody.
And so and you know this from your experience, it's it's like a drug screens. The fact that we notify people we're going to do a drug screen at Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you want to apply it, weeds out a lot of the people that aren't going to pass the drug screen.
Absolutely.
So we say to everybody, we have not only an interview process with all volunteers, where we screen you in. We don't just take everybody, and you have to pass the process. And then the second is we background everybody. That'll eliminate the people that have checkered past.
True.
And now, not and this is a sad reality. We're never going to get arrests. We're only going to get convictions. Some people who are pedophiles and child molesters and such, child abusers, have been arrested, but not necessarily convicted for those things. How difficult those cases are.
Right.
But I've done some expert witness work in this area where I looked at the screening process and said, the red flags for this guy were just enormous, and you were like, well, we need somebody, and he seems nice, and that all the rationalizations we make, and back to the denial thing. Right. And then later on, when we get sued as a church, or a class action suit where there's 5 or 6 victims from this same perpetrator, we go back and we look at everything. We just sort of used faith or intuition, or sort of, he seemed like a good guy, and I go, give me the data, give me the background check. Right. Give me the interview questions here that we ask everybody. Why do you want this position? And what do you do for a child that's doing this, and this? I mean, we see the same thing with schools, which is, the assistant soccer coach somehow gets arrested later on for a sexual relationship with one of his 15-year-old students. And we say, well, how do we miss all the warning signs? That stuff comes out in court. All the warning signs come out in court all the time.
Sure do.
So we're not turning away people that want to volunteer, but we're saying there's a pretty stringent process that you have to go through before we put you in this room with our kids.
Sure, absolutely. Background checks are, they should be one of the most basic steps you would take. Because what's the excuse for not even doing that?
It's expensive, $35.
Yeah.
They don't want to spend the $35.
Right. Imagine what you'll spend to the families of the victims. Right, because your average pedophile doesn't have 5 victims; he's got 50 victims. Right, right. So this is a thing that happens over and over again. But at the same time, you don't count on the background check, because how long does it take them to get caught? Some never get caught. Right. Some have many victims before they're caught. So the background check is the most basic foundational thing you should do. But then you got to build on that with all those other steps you talk about. And then, of course, anytime you have young kids, there should be cameras in all those rooms. Right. So even if if the fox slips through the first layer of protection, the second layer's got to get him, or the third layer, et cetera.
And the supervision, which is we don't just say, okay, you're going in and teach these kids Sunday school. We're going to have a master teacher in there, or a parent volunteer, or somebody that's, I think the Boy Scouts went to this model, which is the two adult.
Always two
adult model with these kids.
Something else that we recommend, always two.
Yep, have to do that. And we learn so many of these types of cases from the news media and from experience. You say, well, how did that happen? And so, your advice to these pastors, and especially the ones that operate the kid programs and the schools and things like that, is that there's just got to be a different level of vigilance.
There has to be. There's no way around it. When you invite people in, there's an unwritten code that you're going to help keep them safe. And not doing that, especially the most obvious of ways, how do you emotionally, mentally, spiritually get past that when you don't? I don't know the answer to that, and I hope I never have to find out.
So tell us from worshipsafe.net kind of what your approach is. Pastors get a hold of you, churches get a hold of you. Tell us kind of what your guys' process, you and Doug Elms, what you do to get them educated and kind of up to speed in terms of a soup to nuts kind of approach.
Sure. When a pastor contacts us, we just want to have a conversation about kind of where they are and what their feelings are, what they believe, what they've done up to this point, how serious are they about going further. We don't want to step in and do a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be done, but at the same time, we'll probably come up with some things that that the pastor hadn't thought about, or that any other church leader hadn't thought about, just because of people like you and I who have done this sort of thing for decades. You know stuff other people don't know. And so it's really just about having a conversation to start. And then from that point forward, we offer all kinds of things in the way of training, for group training, of helping them select and screen, helping them write policies, helping them come up with those background checks. I mean, we can offer a pretty comprehensive program all the way through, even a certification program. We're even, if people are willing to take the minimum amount of training, and it's, once again, competency-based, if they can pass the training, pass the testing, and demonstrate the competency, we will certify them. And then we can even certify them if they adopt all of our stuff, we'll even certify the church, which is a tremendous amount of liability protection
Right.
should something horrible happen.
I mean, you know, from your experience, you know, especially as a police chief, the first thing the plaintiff's attorneys are looking at is, what's the policy? Let me see the written policy about issue X, and then let me see the training about issue X, and were these things covered? And as a church, you say, you know, we have this invitee relationship with these people coming into our facility. I mean, all the things you're talking about that you and Doug Elms provide are those things that are taking it. You're already at 100% liability peg anyway as soon as you open the doors, but we're bringing it down to a substantial level.
Absolutely.
So when you think about this, tell us how to get a hold of you.
Sure, it's really simple. It's just worshipsafe.net, and you can just click on the contact page there. My personal email there is tim@worshipsafe.net, tim@worshipsafe.net. Reach out to me directly there. And I mean, we're always standing by. And by the way, I should say this, since the biggest excuse to not do anything is it costs too much money, we have never not found a way to help a church, even if they don't have any money. We'll find a sponsor. We'll find a way to help if they're willing to do something. We don't want to pass that up.
That's awesome. So my guest has been Tim Keck, and we're talking worshipsafe.net about church security. Tim, thanks for that. I'll come back to you in just a second here. Time for one of my favorite parts of the show. It's Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week. Here's where I get to talk about some of our dumbest criminals who managed to get themselves arrested based on their monumental stupidity. Dateline Ireland here. An Irish beekeeper turned drug dealer is ruining the day. He came up with a bright idea to stash the codes to his accounts, harboring close to $60 million in bitcoins, in the aluminum cap of his fishing rod case, which vanished after he got arrested and sentenced to prison. I guess he put these codes inside this fishing pole carrier here. He rented a house in outside of Dublin. The bitcoins were worth $60 million. Somehow he acquired all these things. He had 12 accounts, 500 bitcoins in each one. His landlord threw away the fishing rod case. They actually went to the dump and tried to look for it, and $60 million worth of bitcoins disappeared because he did not have the codes for them. So don't hide your ill-gotten gains inside your fishing rod carrier. Let's talk about Crime Time IQ test. Let's test your Crime Time IQ with this week's crime quiz question. Okay, as college students have been returning to school, either as a virtual or a live classroom format, some of them are in both, their parents have real concerns about their safety on campus. Crimes of violence, sex crimes, and even kidnappings, rapes, and murders have happened on college and university campuses. So, if you're a parent of a college student, or you are a college student, is there a collection of crime stats that you can see about your particular school online? And the answer is, Tim, you know this, it's called the Clery Act. I knew you knew.
Yeah.
The Clery Act is a collection of campus crime statistics. It was called the Clery Act after Jean Clery. The disclosure of campus security policy and campus crime statistics, or the Clery Act, was signed into act in 1990. Clery Act was named after Jean Clery, who was raped and murdered in her dorm room by a student in April of '86. Her parents created the Clery Act in her memory. It's a federal law that requires colleges to report crimes that occur on campus and school safety policies. So this information is available on the school website. This Clery Act also requires schools to send timely warnings to the school community when there are known risks about public safety on campus, sexual assaults, stalking, domestic violence, school shootings, things like that. Sorry, the Clery Act also contains the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, which requires colleges to disclose educational programming, campus disciplinary process, and victims' rights regarding sexual violence. The Clery Act was expanded in 2013 to include the Campus Save Act, which broadened the Clery requirements to address all incidents of sexual violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Your school will have a Clery Act section on its website. Take a look. You may be or may be not surprised by what you read. This week's Crime Time safety tip is about developing street awareness. It makes good safety sense to pay attention to what you see when you drive into a parking lot or at a store or at a restaurant or even going to church. Look who seems to be standing around alone or in groups. Do they look like they have a normal reason to be there, or do they look like they're waiting for someone like you to arrive? Some bad people have no qualms about selling or buying drugs in front of good people, figuring they wouldn't call the police on them. Some mentally ill or drug or alcohol addicted homeless people will engage in all types of illegal and unhygienic behavior because they just don't care. You want to avoid these people. Park as close as you can to the store or restaurant front doors. Pay attention to street people and make eye contact with them if they try to walk up to you. Don't stare at them as they do illegal things. Sometimes that encourages them to confront you. Ask the store or restaurant manager to call the police if it looks like things are getting out of hand. So, my thanks to Tim Keck for his conversation about church security. We've been talking about a lot of complex issues, training, the need for training, our conversation about assessing churches, about bringing in the right kinds of folks that deal with our kids, especially at a preschool and Sunday school level. We're looking at the training that's going to be required for not only the security team, but also the ushers as well, the communications, the tools that they need to have. One of my partners is an old Air Force pararescue jumper, and he brings a flashlight everywhere. And you go, what do you need a flashlight for? Because sometimes the lights go out. And I always tell my security folks, you better have a flashlight even in broad daylight. So it's just that type of stuff that oftentimes people don't think about. It's the Tim Kecks of the world. It's the Doug Elms of the world that can bring this type of knowledge to your church and to bring it to your organization to say, this is what we do. This is what we've been doing for decades. We know what we're talking about in this situation here. So thanks for listening to this episode of Crime Time. Thanks to Tim Keck. I encourage you to go to my website at crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email, any topics or questions you want me to cover in future shows. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can certainly follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. I always answer all my Twitter stuff. In our world, there are sheep and shepherds and wolves. Too many people are sheep and too few people are shepherds. There are lots of wolves out there. There are not enough police officers or sheriff's deputies to protect us all. Therefore, you need to be a shepherd. Take care of yourself, protect your family, your loved ones, your friends, and your coworkers. Pay attention and be prepared to defend yourself with legal force if necessary. Be a good witness for the police if you see a crime. Stay safe and aware and alert at home, at work, at school, and even on the road. So thanks for listening to Crime Time. My thanks to Tim Keck. My thanks to Jim Whining, producer Matt, and all the good folks at Acts Media Group. I'm Steve Albrecht, and thanks for listening to what I know is right.